Now, the measures imposed by the EU in June 2022 require enhanced cold treatment for citrus exports due to concerns about the spread of false codling moth. It's a pest that's commonly found in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as citrus black spot, a fungal disease that leaves dark spots on the fruit. According to the Citrus Growers Association of Southern Africa, the EU's plant health rules could cut South Africa's orange exports to Europe by 20% this year alone. South Africa's citrus industry says its current pest and disease control measures are highly effective, and it's accusing the EU of protectionism. Let's dig into the details of this story. Let's bring in Mmatlou Kalaba, Senior Analyst at the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy. Thank you for your time this evening. So when the EU says that they require enhanced cold treatment for citrus exports, what does that mean in practice? What do farmers need to do?
Good evening, Raman. Yes, you're right. The EU, as far back as last year, has been imposing some of these strict measures on citrus originating from South Africa. But in particular to the treatment regarding to what EU is required, basically they require that the fruit be cooled or placed in cold conditions for approximately 3/4 of a month, and that needs to happen in the country, in other words in South Africa, before being exported to the EU. But furthermore, it is that the temperatures needs to be as low as -2 degrees. So all those conditions they're difficult to implement. They change the quality of the product and just basically makes it uncompetitive in terms of the quality when it arrives in the EU, and therefore it's seen as a means of reducing the volumes getting into the EU.
Is this measure applied to citrus exports from any other country, like Egypt, for example, or Israel? I know those two do produce a fair bit of citrus. Or is this only aimed at South Africa?
So this would be applied across all the countries, but on the basis that there are, as you mentioned, false codling moth conditions or citrus black spots, the countries that have history of that. And we know that the origin of those two conditions has to do with the climatic environment where citrus is grown. So countries like Venezuela and Egypt would relatively have low, let's say, interceptions regarding those two conditions. So they would still be applied mostly to South Africa, or they will affect South Africa more relative to other suppliers of citrus into the EU.
The EU is raising these concerns about those two specific things that you just mentioned, right? Citrus black spot, a transfer of false codling moth into their market. But what's the evidence, if any, of a broad spread of either problem with South Africa as the source? I'm just trying to understand, when they say this is the problem, why they're accusing South Africa of being the source of it.
So if you just look at the conditions, as you mentioned, the WTO in your introduction, the conditions upon which these kind of issues can be brought or can be used to restrict trade when it relates to sanitary and phytosanitary measures. In other words, the risks of those kind of, say, diseases happening or being important into the EU market or the EU orchards. So as you ask about the evidence, these conditions are generally applicable to warmer climatic conditions, which are not the case in the EU orchards. And in history, they have never developed or been found in the EU. So the risks of those appearing in the EU are very low to non-existent. But besides that, South Africa has indicated that the plant protection measures, the other means of reducing these risks happening, are in place. Furthermore, it's got to do with the fact that these conditions, or there is no scientific base to assume that this will happen in the EU.
Right. So the WTO, the wheels of the WTO, should we say, they tend to turn, but they turn fairly slowly. Will they really be able, though, to provide the relief that farmers in South Africa need in this potential second complaint, in addition, I believe, to the one that was also filed last year?
So you're right. The wheels really grind very slowly. But the WTO, as the global regulator of international trade, it is its role to resolve these kind of measures. It is frustrating taking into account that South Africa last year already, July, have started these processes and it hasn't gained any momentum or led to any action being taken or actually getting into the discussions of it, mainly because the WTO has just left to the two partners to consult and negotiate. But the step that South Africa has taken now, or the citrus industry, has actually pushed the government to say, can we get into the next phase where the WTO will set up a committee and a body that would rule over these matters? And like as you say, they've been lingering for long. And when you say for long, it's not only from last year. We're going back 10, 15 years where each and every year or every second year, these matters develop, but eventually they kind of disappear as the citrus season go towards the end, or South Africa does not have the fruit to supply the EU due to seasonality.
All right, then. One last question for you. Justin Chadwick, the president of the Citrus Growers Association, he says this might leave at least 80,000 tons of South African citrus produce completely stranded. What are the odds of redirecting this produce to other markets in time?
Yes, Justin's point actually is quite valid in terms of the the volume that is at risk of not finding the market if the EU insists. But beyond that, there are thousands, close to 100,000 workers directly in the citrus or in adjacent sectors that rely on these exports. So it is really a critical matter for South African economy, not only the citrus industry or the sector.
Right.
We are already in the middle of a citrus season, so finding another market, it is in a short period of time, is very difficult, if not impossible. It's something that you develop over a period of years because the fruit is already now ready to be harvested. It is already in the pack houses, so it is difficult to find new markets, but alternatives will have to be made. There's no doubt that there will be losses and costs if the EU insists or totally blocks the South African fruit into their markets.